we're going to look at two policy frameworks of thought to guide this particular chapter. One done by John Rawls, 1971 and 2001. He has a justice theory or framework that argues that fairness should guide public choices, especially the principles of basic liberties, for all while still grappling with existing differences. This concept of justice has applicability to deliberations on policy and finance in higher education, especially with respect to policy formation addressing inequality. And also, Amartya Sen, who did his research in 2009, has the choice theory as an alternative to universal principles to guide public choices. His theory argues for a human capabilities approach to economics that focuses on the development of people rather than a human capital approach that reduces people to their economic status. And St. John, who did research in 2003 and 2006, looked at both theories and said they both have merit for looking at patterns of change in higher education. He's doing a review of the patterns of change in higher education, and the book identifies three. And the first is the shift in the trajectory toward equal opportunity from the 1950s to the 1980s back to a period of greater inequality. And this included social and racial inequalities during that time frame, such as the Women's Suffrage Act, the Right to Vote, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which increased the numbers of people of color entering higher education. Number two is the U.S. Department of Education through the decades of K-16 reform had no impact on inequality. The major concern there was accountability and funding, just making sure that that the gap between student learning was being minimized. And number three, enrollment in higher education did expand at a lower cost for students and taxpayers. We have to review the federal policy impact that was occurring during this time frame. The first one being the U.S. Department of Education formed in 1980. Some of the great work that they did in 1960 under President Lyndon Johnson was the war on poverty, which led to improvements in education for the poor at all school levels. In the 70s, many educational efforts were aimed at helping racial minorities, individuals with disabilities, women, and people of non-English backgrounds. And also when President Reagan came into place to get number two, the neoliberal education that had been formed, and they had 5 goals in mind, and that was the root of the market to start marketing education so that more funding opportunities were opened up for higher ed. They also cut public expenditures for higher ed and government profit and government-owned agencies. They also did elimination of the concept of public good and community concept by replacing with individual responsibility and pressuring towards people to find solutions to their lack of education and health care. Also, they did Education Consolidation and Improvement Act of 1980 introduced the ideal of merging and rationalization federal action as means of achieving greater good. The Middle Income Student Assistance Act of 1978 lifted the income cap for student aid, creating challenges to funding for the Title IV program for low-income students. And at this particular time, higher ed education went from grant funding predominantly to actual student loans, and students began to incur a lot of debt. And also the Nation at Risk document was introduced in 1963 with a new agenda for national standards and accountability. And the outcome of that was fingers were pointed at high schools and left higher ed off the hook. So now there became a competition for ongoing funding between higher ed and the public school system. Other federal impacts that I'd like to briefly review that we've already talked about is the federal government student aid system shifted its strategy from grants to loans, and also the completion rate slowed and inequalities in completion rates widened, but at a slower rate than expected given the rise in tuition and net cost of education. The Advisory Committee on Student Financial Assistance addressed financial access and economic stratification of higher education opportunities with great difficulty. And the reason being is that the focal point here other federal impacts that I'd like to briefly review. Now we want to take a look at the state policy on finance and accountability and what states are doing to help fund higher education. First of all, access to higher education has remained at the level of an individual's right. There is no constitutional coverage or coverage by the 14th Amendment as it is for K through 12 education, where students have a right to equal access to education has been established through those documents, and also access to higher education has no legal base to litigate for equal finance access. And I think there was a case in, was that Michigan? They lost because they could not prove, racial discrimination issues there. And also the state framework provide the basis for arguments about coherence and policy on higher education. And the result of losing state funding, many states are using new accountability and performance funding.
Oh, Lord.
This chapter also prepares does a comparative study on case study policy on separation, access, and college success of 6 states, and North Carolina is one of those, Minnesota, Florida, Indiana, California, and Michigan. As far as academic separation, North Carolina didn't have any information available on that, but we pretty much kind of know what that is. Minnesota, they raised their high school requirements to help prepare academically. So did Florida and California. Well, all 5 of them did. And Indiana did something called the Core 40 Requirement State Default Curriculum. And they have something called the 21st Century Scholars Program. Michigan, as well, set the graduation requirements for state curriculum, and they saw a drop in the ACT scores because they made it as an 11th grade exam versus 12th grade. Now, North Carolina, of course, has done the Common Core standard, so we'll see how that turns out in a few years once we collect more data on it. But that's only in STEM courses that we may be able to see some of those increases on positive impact. Access and diversity. North Carolina adopted financial aid policies that promote equal opportunity and it increased the access to higher education, but we won't know whether it increased the diversity numbers just yet. When we get some numbers on that, we'll talk about it. Minnesota did a needs-based aid for tuition, and it did increase student diversity, and it's a workable situation. Florida did a merit aid strategy that was difficult to maintain because they had to have legislative support when the money went down. Indiana did the needs-based aid with tuition increase. That was a workable deal as well. California developed a guiding framework for state higher education systems, and all other state systems from California. They have the racial and economic stratification built into the process, but it limited access of diverse groups. It was only the elite top students. They allowed some students who, well, they weren't substandard, but they were prepared college ready. And Michigan also did a needs-based aid with tuition increase as well. So, with retention college completion and policy, states are predominantly using two types of funding, and number one is the performance funding system, which are usually limited to public colleges, and also have the funding aid in New York program. Research with state data systems that possibility for performance intervention merit further testing. They also have the formula funding, which includes a base rate of per student subsidy. That's a little bit more rare. High need-based student aid and market systems. Your private colleges have higher completion rates. Private nonprofit college completion rates vary across states. There are substantial gaps in completion rates at public two-year community college and private for-profit institutions. And some community colleges are developing four-year degrees, which is going to create some discrepancy there as well. So the two-year colleges and the two-year colleges that are developing four-year degrees aren't counted in the data that they're looking at here. For-profit institutions will enroll a high number of underprepared students. So their completion rate is going to be less if those students aren't able to remediate In this slide, we're going to look at state policy effects on program success. When looking at the 5 states that are implementing the programs, the new universities, college campuses, and their 2-year college campuses, professional development was one of the factors that was identified as needing consistent, being able to teach the actual program. In California and Michigan, they had some school funding while implementing changes. So this created some problems with being able to smoothly transition in the process. There were also variations in the amount of debt required for access to community colleges and for-profit colleges. For-profit colleges generally offer some types of loans to their constituents, and they make it easy for them to be able to qualify for the financial aid. And these are the colleges that will have students with high debt loads. And for the community colleges, based on who it is that's accessing an entrance, if you've got your first generation people who may not qualify for financial aid, they may be paying quite a bit debt-wise to be able to complete their degrees. But most high school students, especially if they come from low socioeconomic, and maybe the ones from middle socioeconomic status, also can qualify for state funding with them. When they look at the gap between races, the gap was slightly closed between blacks and whites in enrollment in 4-year colleges. And some of that was attributed to the for-profit colleges, where we had more blacks enrolled when you started looking at proportions in across the board 4-year colleges. Latinos had the lowest representation for 4-year colleges, and one of the articles stated that they were at the program